Welcome to everyone who's joined today. I'm Simon Lewin. I'm based at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and we're one of the partner institutions in the GELA project funded by EDCTP, as you probably know, and all the other institutions are listed on the slide here today. It's great to have you on the call. Really good turnout today, and thanks, Anka, for recording. I know there's some people who can't make it, and it would be very helpful for them to be able to review this. So I'll start by just saying a little bit about the goal of the webinar. But before I do that, I wanted to mention that we will have quite a lot of time for questions and discussion at the end. So if you have a question, you can either sort of hang on to it or put it in the chat, and we'll come to those at the end. Anka's going to keep an eye on the chat for me. We really would be keen to hear anything you're uncertain about or where you need more information. This is really the start of a process, so there'll also be other opportunities to learn more about how a guideline works. So you're all on the call today because you're either a part of the steering group for one of the GELA countries, or you have been invited to be a guideline panel member. And as a guideline panel member, you'll be deciding whether to recommend a specific health intervention in Malawi, Nigeria, or South Africa. And to help you decide, you'll be presented with relevant research evidence that will be gathered as part of the project. And we'll be organizing this evidence in something that's called an evidence to decision framework. This is a quite sort of simple tool, really, that's been developed by the GRADE working group as a way of organizing and presenting evidence for people who on a guideline panel and need to use that evidence to make a decision about an intervention. I'll say more about that in a moment. And the goal of this webinar is really just to prepare you for this guideline development process. So what I'll try and cover today is, firstly, how we make recommendations with the GRADE evidence decision framework. Secondly, how we assess how certain or confident we are in the evidence that is presented in that framework. And I'll say something very brief at the end about the next steps, the guideline panel meeting itself. So let's start with the GRADE evidence to decision framework. As most of you know, the process of developing a guideline has many different steps, as shown here in this diagram, starting off with identifying the question and right the way through to when the final recommendation is disseminated to healthcare workers, managers, and other stakeholders. And many of you will have been involved in this first stage, identifying the question in your setting. So as part of the GELA project, we've been engaged in a priority setting process. It's involved first developing a long list of topics on maternal newborn health that were considered relevant to each of the 3 GELA partner countries, engaging with the steering group, yourselves and other experts, to try and identify which are the highest priority issues in that list. There was also a stakeholder survey to gather that kind of information. And the final topics were decided by the steering group. And now we're actually entering phase number 2, which is where we're starting to look for the research or the evidence that will help us to address the questions that you've identified. But what we're going to be focusing on today is a later stage where the guideline development groups get together to discuss this evidence and make a recommendation. So, as many of you know, these kinds of decision processes start with a health problem and an intervention or option to address it, and we hope will end with a recommendation or decision. And in between, there may be a whole range of different questions that decision makers would typically be thinking about and want answers to, including things like, what are the benefits and harms of this intervention? Is it feasible to implement this in my setting? Will it be acceptable to the different groups involved, to healthcare workers, to patients, to families, and so on? How do we implement it? What's it going to cost? But typically in a decision-making process in the past, these questions were considered in a quite sort of jumbled and unstructured way. And we're trying with the GRADE evidence to decision framework to move from this type of decision-making process to one that's more systematic and transparent. And what I mean by that is that within that decision-making process, we explicitly consider a set of criteria that we think are important for most of these kinds of decisions. And these include things, as I mentioned earlier, like the benefits and harms of options, the resources required, equity and human rights impacts, acceptability and feasibility, etc. And for each of these criteria, we, and this is something else the project team will be doing, we assemble the evidence, and we may also gather other kinds of information, for example, to do with local experience in your setting for that criteria. The guideline development group or panel then looks at the evidence for each criteria, makes a judgment about it, and ultimately puts all of that together to see whether overall we think the benefits outweigh the harms, and this intervention is feasible, acceptable, and something we can afford to implement in our setting. And that ultimately leads to a recommendation. Yeah, so that is the aim of the evidence decision framework. And this will lead you in this case through 5 or so criteria for each recommendation. We're starting off with the question, should intervention X be recommended? It might be enteral feeding for children admitted to hospital, or another kind of intervention in your setting. And we will look at the criteria that I mentioned. What are the benefits and harms of the intervention? In other words, what are the effects on people's health, on their use of services, and so on? What resources will be required to implement this intervention? Is it acceptable to those involved? Is it feasible to implement? And what are the implications for equity? And for each of these criteria, the framework will present the best available research evidence. And this, of course, could be from both quantitative research, for example, randomized trials, which might be looking at the effectiveness of an intervention, as well as qualitative evidence that might be telling us important information about the acceptability and feasibility of an intervention. And we may be presenting both global evidence in these systematic reviews, but also local evidence that's of high relevance to your setting. And in the ETD framework, you may also see other types of information where this is relevant. For example, local regulations that are relevant, or other related guidelines from your setting that relate to the particular question being discussed. The research evidence will sometimes be presented as numbers in tables, in summary of findings tables, such as the one you see here. And you may also see it presented as text. Sometimes in relation to a particular criteria, we may find no relevant research evidence. And sometimes we may find evidence that we describe as indirect. And this is where we're not able to find evidence that assesses the effect or acceptability of the intervention for the group that we're most interested in. But we have found evidence from another group or of a related intervention that we think will shed some light or be relevant to the decision-making process. And we term this indirect evidence. Where we do have evidence available, we will have assessed how certain or confident we are in this evidence. So you'll see terms in relation to the effectiveness evidence from systematic reviews describing that evidence as very low certainty or moderate certainty, and similarly for the qualitative evidence from systematic reviews of qualitative studies may be described as moderate confidence or high confidence. I'll say a little bit more in a moment about how we make those judgments. And as a guideline development group, you'll be asked to discuss the research results and any other information presented in the evidence to decision framework. And we'd really like to emphasize that your views and experiences are critical when interpreting evidence. You've been invited to be part of this guideline development group because you have experience and expertise in a particular area. And the kinds of things we are, need your input for would include questions like, if an intervention leads to an improvement for an outcome, is the size of improvement an important difference? If the intervention is more expensive than another option, is it really worth it? If the intervention is popular or acceptable to patients but disliked by health workers, how much weight should be placed on each perspective? So these are judgments that the guideline development group may have to make. And it's really important that all members of the guideline development group, regardless of your background as a patient, as a healthcare worker, or a policymaker, get involved and share their views. And all of this discussion will take place in the guideline development group before you reach a recommendation. You'll also see that we talk about two different kinds of recommendations, if you like, depending on the strength of that recommendation. The first is a strong recommendation, and a guideline group would make this kind of recommendation where you're confident that the desirable effects clearly outweigh the undesirable effects for this particular intervention. However, there may be cases where that's not the case, where we think, well, the desirable effects probably outweigh the undesirable effects, but we're not 100% sure, or we think they're closely balanced. We're not confident about the trade-offs in all situations. And we may therefore, as a guideline development group, specify certain conditions or caveats for the implementation of this intervention. For example, particular population groups, levels of care, and so on. And we term that a conditional recommendation because it's conditional upon certain issues being in place or conditional for particular groups and so on. So how does the guideline development group reach agreement? As far as possible, recommendations should be based on consensus within the panel or guideline development group. And the chair has methods for assessing agreement. For example, you may be asked to do a show of hands to see to what extent people in the panel are on the same page with regard to a particular question, or there may be secret balloting. But these methods will be discussed with you at the start of the meeting. But as I mentioned, we try to reach a recommendation as far as possible through consensus. Very importantly, you'll be asked to justify the recommendation that you make, and you'll see that this is a section of the GRADE evidence to decision framework. This justification should refer to the research evidence as well as any other information that the panel has assessed to be relevant to the decision being made. The reason the justification is important is this is what allows others reading the recommendation or thinking about using it in their settings to understand the thinking behind it and how the evidence has informed that recommendation. Where you decide to recommend an intervention, you'll also be asked as the guideline development group to consider what implementation issues should be noted. There may be information from the evidence gathered on the acceptability and feasibility of the intervention, or based on local information that highlights specific considerations that we need to take into account when implementing. Of course, there are always gaps in the information that we have, and the guideline development group may recommend or note particular aspects of the intervention implementation that should be monitored, or where additional evaluation is needed. And of course, you, based on your review of the evidence, may make suggestions for future research to address research gaps. So I'm going to move on to work through an example of a recommendation where the evidence decision framework was used. This is drawn from a guideline developed some years back now by WHO. And what I'll be showing is really a high-level summary of the information presented, but I think we'll give you a flavor of what this might look like in practice. So this guideline focused on task shifting for maternal and newborn health. It was called optimizing in this case. And as you know, this is really an attempt to address the severe lack of health workers in many settings. And the guideline was asking the question whether certain tasks can be moved from one group of healthcare workers to another. For example, from doctors to nurses, or from nurses to lay or community health workers. The guideline addressed a large number of task shifting questions, and one of them that this particular panel considered was whether lay or community health workers should provide continuous support during labour in the presence of a skilled birth attendant. And by continuous support, the WHO meant primarily social support for women in the form of comfort and reassurance during labour, and not clinical care. And by lay health workers, the WHO meant lay people who were trained to perform healthcare functions, in this case, providing continuous support, but do not have formal professional education. So they're not nurses or doctors or midwives. So the panel considered the benefits and harms of lay health workers providing continuous support. The review, the systematic review of controlled studies in this area did not find any studies that directly examined the effect of using lay health workers to provide continuous support to women during labour. But some indirect evidence was found that addressed this kind of support provided by other cadres, such as Lamaze instructors, midwife apprentices, retired nurses, and so on. And this review, this evidence showed that providing continuous support during labour led to fewer cesarean births with moderate certainty, low certainty evidence that there was less use of oxytocin during the childbirth period, and low certainty evidence that women used less pain relief medication during childbirth. So what was the panel's assessment of this evidence? They concluded that the benefits are probably larger than the harms in this case. As I mentioned, resource use is another important criterion within the evidence decision framework. In this case, a systematic review was not carried out, but information was gathered through expert opinion in the panel, and they pointed to the need for some training and supervision, as well as transport for the lay health workers as being possible sources of costs. And their assessment of overall was that the resources required to implement continuous support during labour were relatively small. So clearly this kind of approach involves introducing a new cadre into the maternity wards, and the question was asked as part of the framework whether this would be acceptable to stakeholders. To answer this, a systematic review of qualitative studies was undertaken, and this showed the following with moderate confidence: that mothers appreciated the support they received from lay health workers, and midwives also appreciated this contribution to their workload, noting that they had a lot of other tasks to do, and acknowledged that lay health workers had considerable skills in communicating with mothers because they often shared a similar social background, spoke the same language, and so on. But some midwives did note that they disliked the new, more medical relationship with mothers. They felt that this social support role should probably be part of their domain, and this led to some so-called turf battles between lay health workers and midwives over whose domain this was. Some lay health workers were also concerned about the irregular hours involved in supporting women in labour and travelling at night at times to deliver that support. So what was the panel's assessment? They conclude that stakeholder acceptability here was uncertain because of these considerations. So is it feasible to implement this? The systematic review that we conducted did not identify any direct data, but there were some assumptions made based on the review and expert opinion. That the approach seemed simple to deliver, required minimal training and supervision, no supplies, and that changes to norms or regulations were unlikely to be needed. And the panel's assessment here was that the approach was feasible to implement. What are the implications for equity? This question was not specifically assessed in this guideline because there was a general assumption for the guideline as a whole that task shifting was intended to improve equity and provide care more widely to groups that perhaps don't have access to it. So just a summary of the panel's assessments. As I mentioned, they conclude the benefits are probably larger than the harms, that the resources required are small, that it's feasible to implement this, but it's uncertain if it's acceptable to stakeholders. And what they finally recommended after consideration was as follows. We recommend the use of lay health workers to provide continuous support during labour in the presence of a skilled birth attendant. However, appropriate attention must be paid to the acceptability of the intervention to other healthcare providers. And their justification for this was that the provision of continuous support is probably effective and feasible, may have few undesirable effects, and may reduce inequalities by extending care to underserved populations, although there may be acceptability issues. They also made some implementation considerations based on the systematic review of qualitative research and also including contributions from the guideline development group or panel. And this highlighted issues such as encouraging acceptability among professionals by involving them in planning and implementing this kind of support and making roles and regulations clear to reduce this problem of turf battles. And encouraging acceptability among lay health workers through incentives, travel arrangements, training and supervision, and so on. So that was a little flavor of the kinds of information that might be presented in evidence to decision framework. I'll now go on to say a little bit about how we assess certainty in the research results. You will have heard me talking about this over the last few minutes. So most people have an opinion when they read a piece of research about how much trust they place in those particular research results. But typically that's an implicit opinion that's quite hard to explain. And what the grade approach does is to try and make our judgments about how much confidence or trust we have in research results explicit, transparent, and systematic. So when you see references in the materials you'll be sent for the guideline development group meeting to things like certainty or confidence, how do we actually reach those judgments? This is not a mechanical process, it is a judgment, but we do this in a systematic and transparent way for each outcome or review finding. And the GRADE working group, international collaborative network of researchers and decision makers, have developed this approach and adapted it to be appropriate for different kinds, for evidence from different kinds of research methods. For example, we have GRADE for effectiveness studies, GRADE for qualitative research, and so on. But all of these approaches have a set of shared characteristics, and that's what I'm going to just very briefly run through now. So this is really a very rough guide, but I hope it'll give you some indication of how we reach these judgments. So here's an example. Your Ministry of Health is considering lockdowns because of a new pandemic. They commissioned 2 systematic reviews to inform their decision about this. One focuses on the effect of lockdowns on people's physical and mental health and considers quantitative studies. And another focuses on people's views and experiences of lockdowns and includes qualitative studies. And one of the findings of all of this is that people in lockdowns did not experience any difference to their mental health. What might have made you question this finding? The systematic reviews themselves were well done, but are there other aspects about the included studies that you might wonder about? Now, of course, in an ideal world, we would very much like to have the situation where we find a lot of studies on the question we're answering. All of the studies are very well done, well conducted. They ask the same question as your review. In other words, they focus on the same population, the same settings and the same intervention that you're interested in. And the studies all show the same thing. They point in the same direction. But in the real world, we find that that's often not the case. Some of the studies that we find may not be very well done or very well conducted, and this makes us less confident in the results. And we refer to this in grade as risk of bias when we're talking about quantitative studies and methodological limitations when we're talking about qualitative studies. So this is one consideration that we take into account. We also sometimes find that the studies don't answer exactly the same question that we're asking. For instance, the people involved, their settings, or the types of intervention that they are using may not be exactly what we're looking for. For example, we might be asking a question about the effects of lockdowns on all populations, men, women, adults, and children. But what we might find is studies that focus only on men. And in that situation, we may be less confident about this research because we're not sure how directly applicable it is to our populations of interest. And in grade, we refer to that as concerns about directness or relevance. So that's another consideration that's taken into account. A third problem that we encounter is that sometimes not all studies point in the same direction. For instance, lockdowns may make some people feel better, others may not have noticed it too much, and others may find all sorts of problems or issues are worse than before. And where we have a sort of variation of this sort and the results are not pointing in one clear direction, that may make us also feel less confident about the results. And we refer to this in grade as consistency or coherence of the finding or outcome. A fourth problem, and this is also a very common issue that we encounter when looking for evidence, is that we have very few studies available that address the question we're interested in, or that the studies we do have include very few people. And in this situation, it also makes us less confident about the findings. We just have very little to go on. And we refer to this in grade as imprecision, or if it's qualitative research, as data adequacy. The final scenario that may give us concern about how confident we can be in the research is where we have reason to believe that there are studies that have not been published that may show very different type of results to the ones that have been published. So in other words, there's studies that are outside of the frame. And we call this dissemination or publication bias in grade. And where we think that that may be present, it may also decrease our confidence in the results that we have. So where we have concerns about any of those 5 considerations that I mentioned, and we think those concerns are important, it may lead us to downgrade our certainty or confidence in the results from high to moderate or low, and sometimes very low. So when we say we have high certainty, essentially we're saying we think the results are a good reflection of what one would find in the real world. And when we say we have very low certainty at the other end, we're essentially saying we don't know if this is a good reflection of the effects of that intervention or what we might see in practice. So that was a very, very brief introduction to the grade approach. To finish off, I'll just say something very brief about what comes next, the guideline panel meeting. So sometime in the next couple of months, you'll be invited to the meeting, and you might be wondering, how should I prepare for this? Well, please make sure you've cleared time in your diary. You'll need your full attention for that duration of that meeting, and also made time to read the materials that will be sent to you beforehand. So you'll be sent an evidence to decision framework populated with the evidence that the GELA team has found in relation to the question, including evidence from reviews, as I mentioned, as well as local information. And it's really valuable and helpful if you can read those materials before you come to the meeting and make notes about any questions or thoughts you might have about the evidence presented or the guideline topic. And then after that, of course, the guideline development group will discuss that evidence in the meeting itself. There'll be further briefings, of course, before this meeting that I'm going to stop here, and I'd be very happy to hear any comments you might have or questions. So please feel free to either unmute to ask your questions or to put those questions in the chat. Would anyone like to start? Anything that seemed unclear or where you might need more information? Okay, I see Gerald has his hand up. Do you want to unmute and go ahead, Gerald?
Yeah, thanks, Simon, for the very clear and excellent presentation. I was just kind of thinking aloud, if your question has a few dimensions. For example, it's asking about whether an intervention would be suitable for multiple population groups, or maybe it's another dimension apart from population groups. Do you run the whole the assessment for each dimension for each of those dimensions? For example, if you have a few demographic groups, or maybe it's something. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Gerald. That's an interesting question. I hope I'm going to try and answer, but then just please tell me if I haven't fully understood what you're saying. So we are potentially interested in the effects of the intervention across different groups, and there's sort of several stages of the process at which that might be considered. So when the guideline question is being developed, those involved would have been thinking about, how specific is this question? Are we talking, for example, about enteral feeding in all children, or only in children of a certain age, or children with certain health conditions? So some of that might be pre-specified up front as we develop the guideline question, and then the GELA teams would be looking for evidence in relation to how that question sort of been, the parameters around that question. But of course, there may be other aspects that we also think are important that we need to think about. So we may say, okay, we're interested in children aged 0 to 12, but we think there might be important variation when we compare infants to children aged 2 to 5 and then older children. So we may decide up front to sort of look at those groups in a differentiated way when we look at the evidence. And sometimes when we analyze the evidence, we may also find other variation that we haven't necessarily predicted or fully predicted. But that where that is the case, or where it's been planned in that way, it will be presented to the guideline development group as part of the evidence in the evidence to decision framework, so that you can take a decision as a guideline development group on whether, for example, you want to recommend this intervention for all children across those age groups, or whether you want to say something different for infants versus children of other ages, for example. Does that address your question?
Surely, yeah. Many thanks, Simon.
Great. Any other queries or comments? And others from the GELA team, please feel free to chip in on these questions or share an example. Idris, yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, Simon, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Idris, postdoctoral fellow, Stellenbosch University, part of the GELA project. I was just wondering, I mean, I'm new to all of this, but I was just wondering, Simon, when you discussed the qualitative evidence, I was just thinking, you know, some findings are based on people's perception, right? And which could go in different directions. So I was just wondering, if you only have that kind of evidence to work with, how do you really rate the confidence in those findings, which are most based on people's perception and experiences? Yeah, I was just really curious to know what normally happens in such a scenario, if that's the only body of evidence that you really have to look at.
Thanks, Idris. That's a really interesting and important question. We draw on different kinds of evidence to address different questions within the evidence to decision framework. So where we are trying to address an effectiveness question, does this intervention work? Whether it's does it have the intended effect on outcomes? We generally looking at quantitative evidence, ideally from randomized studies, but otherwise from other kinds of comparative studies. And in contrast, when we're asking questions about how acceptable or feasible something is, we may want to draw on qualitative evidence, but sometimes other kinds of evidence as well that may be quantitative, like surveys. So you may find survey data on issues like the acceptability of an intervention. So we are looking at different kinds of evidence for different questions. It is, not infrequently the case that Department of Health or Ministry of Health has to take an intervention, a decision on an intervention, and we find there's little or no effectiveness data available in the published literature. And actually, this was a very common occurrence, particularly at the early stages of the COVID pandemic, where governments needed to make some, introduce interventions, but we were very there was very little known about how these might work for this new type of bug. So in those cases, we may look for indirect evidence from other similar kinds of interventions, if such a thing exists. But in other scenarios, a decision may have to be made based on the expert views of the panel and the information we have with regard to other considerations within the framework. So for example, what we know about the acceptability and feasibility of an intervention, if we know something there. So that's part of the answer to your question, I think. The other part is you're right that when we collect qualitative evidence on people's views, we do have to be aware that they are views, but sometimes that's the only kind of information that it's possible to have on an acceptability question, for example. But sometimes we also have qualitative data that may come from observing what people do. And there's circumstances where we might give that more weight because we could actually say, well, not only do people say that they thought this, but we saw them doing it. So, it's more, we're more confident in that result than we might be if we only had people's views alone. So that's another way this kind of variation might come in and be taken into account. Does that answer your question, Idris?
Yes, it does, Simon. It does. Yeah, what I gather is it links to the question.
You're breaking up a bit. So if you had another point in there, could you put it in the chat?
No, I was just saying thank you, Simon.
Okay, no problem. Any other comments or questions? If you're also wondering what might happen next, we could also have some discussion about that.
I think that would be useful, Simon.
Thanks, Anke. Well, you may want to, I'm just looking at who's on the call, and somebody may want to correct me if I get some of this wrong. I see Nanu is on the call, which is great. So as I mentioned when we started, the questions that the guideline development processes will be addressing are close to finalized. I think in Malawi, South Africa, and Nigeria, there are details that are still being worked out. And we're assembling the teams to put together or find and put together the evidence in relation to the first sort of question from each country. That process of finding and reviewing the evidence will probably take a couple of months at least, 2 to 3 months, maybe a bit longer, depending on the size of this extent of the process. But once that's done, those teams will then apply the grade approach to the findings from those reviews, and will then package that evidence into the evidence to decision framework. And what you'll see in the evidence to decision framework will actually be a summary of the evidence. We call that a summary of findings or a summary of qualitative findings. But you'll be able to also find links to tables which will give you all the details of the evidence found. And when those evidence to decision frameworks are ready, a guideline development group meeting will be scheduled, to which you'll be invited as a member. You'll be sent these evidence to decision frameworks and all the sort of linked information in advance by email, which we hope you'll read. And then at the meeting itself, there'll be a brief presentation of those results after some general introductions, and then a facilitated discussion. So each guideline development group will have a chair who's helping to facilitate those discussions, as well as a methodologist on hand, somebody who can answer any questions that arise about the evidence, how that evidence was gathered, and any important sort of methodological issues. And this would also include explaining the grade assessments of certainty or confidence in the evidence. And it'll be during that meeting that you then review the evidence and collectively make a decision about what kind of recommendation to make. Anka Nyaniwe, I don't know if you want to add anything about the specific process in your settings. or anything I've forgotten about the process or the timeline. I see Amir is also on the line. Please feel free to chip in. And Emmanuel, yes.
Thanks, Simon. And nothing on that from my side. I don't know if the others want to add anything. Emmanuel.
Yes, thanks, Simon and Anka. I think the other two pieces of information would be that some of the members of the guideline panel are at the moment doing the primary systematic reviews, again, in preparation for this. And the second bit would be that we will have a simulation meeting preparatory to the main meeting itself that will address, the recommended, formulate the recommendations related to the questions each of the countries is working on. So just to let participants know that there would be one step in between before the final guideline meeting, and that particular meeting would be just to simulate what we expect to happen sometime ahead.
Thanks, Emmanuel. That's very helpful. Anka?
Yeah, thanks, Simon, and thanks, Emmanuel, for highlighting that. I also wanted to get back to the sort of capacity development activities that are ongoing and planned. So, as you've said, we're currently doing the primary systematic reviews, and I know there's some people on the call that are attending. Just to say that we are going to have another course starting in August. So anyone that didn't have the chance to join this one, there will be another chance to actually participate in the prime and systematic reviews in August. So that is the one thing that I wanted to say. And then the other thing is that it would be really nice to hear from you if there's anything else where you think you need more information, or you maybe need more training, or and we can see how to meet those needs, maybe in form of other webinars, or exploring opportunities for you to to strengthen your skills in a certain aspect. So do let us know if there's anything linked to what Simon said today, anything specific that you feel you might need more information or training on.
Thanks, Anka. Could you just say a bit more about how people will be informed about the August course?
Sure. So we will circulate an advert for that one once registration opens. It will probably be towards the end of June, and we will circulate the advert to everyone on the email list. So yeah, to make sure that everybody is informed.
Super, thanks. We still have a couple of minutes. Any further comments or questions?
Simon, I see there's a question from Sumant in the chat, whether there will be
great.
training on grade diagnostics. I don't think we planned anything. I don't know, Simon, if you want to comment on that.
As far as I'm aware, none of the PICOs address a diagnostics question. I could be wrong about that, but if there's particular interest among those involved around that, I expect we could find some online resources that people could look at. There's certainly some online training materials on applying grade to that kind of evidence. So again, I think if people could let us know if that's a particular interest of theirs, or they, for example, you're involved in a guideline process outside of the GELA project where you're looking at this and want to know more. I don't know that there's anything other than that planned, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, no, nothing planned.
So I see Sunday's asking, will the recording be shared? Yes, I think that the plan is that it will be uploaded to YouTube and then the link will be shared. Anke, please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's correct, Simon. We'll let everyone know once it's up on the YouTube channel.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, if not, then I really just wanted to say thank you all for joining today. It was great to see so many people on the call, and thank you for your questions. Thanks also to Anke for organizing all of this, and I certainly hope that I'll have a chance to interact with at least some of you again in the guideline development group meetings. So goodbye from me, and I'll hand back to Anke in case there's anything you need to add before we finish.
Thanks so much, Simon. And just also thank you from my side to you for presenting today. I think it was a great presentation, and thanks to everybody who participated. Great that you could make the time to join us. And I'm also looking forward to engaging with everyone at a later stage. And yeah, hope you have a good afternoon.
Goodbye
Thank
for
you.
now.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Anke. Thanks, Simon.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.